Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this week's business building session. I'm Mike O'Neill with Bench Builders, and I'm going to be your host for today's Q&A session. Joining us today as our expert panelist is Kristen Mashburn with KB Mashburn. Kristen, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
We were glad you're with us as well. And for those who have joined us in the past, you all know Rhonda. I'm welcoming my colleague Rhonda Beard back. Rhonda is going to be speaking later on this morning on the topic of diversity and inclusion, and we're going to be fielding your questions. Rhonda, welcome. Good to have you back.
Thanks, Mike. Good morning, and thanks for joining us, Kristen. We're excited to have everybody with us this morning.
Just for those who are not familiar, we launched these Q&A sessions really to bring experts together like Kristen to help you as business owners, as leaders, as HR professionals, stay on top of what the important issues are, all for the effort of helping you build your business. To kind of give you an idea of what you can expect, the format we will follow is pretty straightforward, and that is anybody who is registered will be getting an email follow-up that will contain not only a link to the recording, but also a link to the slides that we're using. So be on the lookout for that follow-up email, and you'll probably get that within 24 hours after we wrap up this morning. Also, this is purposely designed to be less of a webinar and more of a Q&A session, meaning we want to hear from you. We want to ask Kristen, the expert, questions that are on your mind. So we want to hear from you. And so if you would go to the chat box, that is how we're going to be hearing back from you. But it's that chat box I'd like to use just for a moment. Before we transition to Kristen, I'd like to ask you, the attendees, a question. And that is, last week, our expert panelist was Kevin Monroe. And Kevin stressed the importance of when you are leading a meeting to set the proper tone. And in doing so, he tried to encourage us as participants last week, and we're going to try that with today's Q&A session. We're going to use this chat box to kind of set the tone. So what I'm going to ask you, do me a favor. If you haven't opened up chat box, do so. And we've got a question for you. And that is, 2020, it's turned out to be a very eventful year. And we're only halfway through it. And we've seen lots of negative during the last 4+ months. Probably too many to even begin to list. But when you see so much negative, it's real easy to dwell on that negative. And what I like to do is kind of ask this question, and this could apply not only in your professional life, but in your personal life. And that is, amongst all this negative, there is positive that has occurred. Do us a favor, share with us via the chat box, what are some of the positive things that you have experienced or have seen as a result of the last 4 months? So let us hear from you. Okay, Rhonda, I have a little echo and something's happening to the camera. Keeps going very dark. Don't know what that means. I see now.
Okay, that's
Maybe
better.
that's better. Okay, I think I was probably partially blocking it. My bad. Okay. Okay. The question was positive things. Kelly, you know Kevin, like Chris and I do. Kelly writes, people coming together, helping each other. And then Monique, people coming together, second time we've seen that, in new ways to communicate. You know, this Q&A series is an example of new ways that we're communicating. We kicked this off on the front end of this, and so that's spot on here. Gabe, hey, Gabe, good to have you with us. Personal growth. People are using this time to get perspective. Well said, Gabe. More gardening. Let's see, Kristen, is that what you wrote?
That's what I wrote, yeah.
I
had to add something too. I assumed you were asking me as well.
I am. I'm sorry. I am. That applies to you too, Rhonda. I'm getting more black under my nails because I'm doing the exact same thing. Just getting out and getting in the dirt does my soul good. Hey, Katie, good to have you with us. Feel less stress. Wow. and more relaxed. Here's the reason, because you're working more from home. Okay, that's very good to know. Rhonda says lots of time on webinars to expand knowledge and education. We hope you're finding these webinars helpful in that regards. All right, Rebecca, professionally, let me scroll back up. They're coming in fast. Professionally, transition to an in-person fundraiser to online. Exceeded fundraising goals. Wonderful. Good to hear, Rebecca. Personally, I am a much better cook. That's good to read. And gave another one. Community. People working together. I've learned what's important and what's not. Oh, man. So well said. We're getting a sense of really what matters. And I think that's going to fit nicely into what Kristen's going to be sharing with us this morning. Hey, Kevin, good to have you on with us. More quality time with family. Kevin and I are neighbors. Kevin, I'm looking forward to be able to spend time with you in person when this is all over. More time to improve and enhance your business skills. Great. Hey, Jason writes, I use this time to finish my master's degree. Now, there's a way we can send an applaud, but I'm going to do it like this. To finish your master's degree in leadership. More importantly, I forged deeper relationships with many of the most important people in my life, tons of personal development work, and started doing some coaching. Jason and I recently connected on LinkedIn, and congratulations, Jason. That's phenomenal. I'm looking forward to learning more about that. And Jonathan, I've created a positive place via social media called the Institute for Resilience on LinkedIn and Facebook. And so he's included a link. So let me invite you. I've not seen that, but let me invite you to go to that to see what Jonathan has created. Hey, I appreciate what y'all have done here. And if you want to add to this while we're talking, let me encourage you to do so. Kristen, I want to transition to you now. We've invited you to join us, and in advance, we ask people who participate, what would you like to hear us cover in these topics? And that's kind of drives who we've invited to be an expert panelist. That's in large part why we invited Kristen to join us. And we've invited her to join us to kind of deal with this topic, helping to increase team productivity, build strong culture, and unite your team around company goals. That's a mouthful, but Kristen, you list yourself in your LinkedIn profile as a corporate culture consultant. Tell us a little bit about what does that mean to you?
Yeah, for me, it's really just working with organizations to help them to be the organization they want to be able to share be able to be the leaders that they want to be so that they can share their mission with the world. So ultimately it centers around building that culture. That's how we get it done, if that makes sense, is through culture work.
Now, my understanding, we've had a chance to spend some time before our time together. I've got to know you and a little bit about your background, but I'd like to kind of get you to share that with the folks who are with us today. KP Mashburn is the name of your consulting firm. How long have you been doing this work as a consultant?
Almost 2 years now.
Gotcha. Now, You didn't go into that role cold. My understanding is that you were in key leadership position. So would you mind kind of sharing with these folks about what you've done and what would qualify you to work with folks as a consultant and why you've got the credibility that you already have?
Sure. I kind of always shy away from using the word expert, or, I get a little squeamish when I see it on the screen. I appreciate the title, but yeah, I do have some background in this kind of work. And I worked in a financial institution for a decade or so. And in that time, I was able to become chief of staff. And our biggest concern in my work as chief of staff was making sure our organization was able to run smoothly with the resources that we had, keeping people loyal to the company, keeping people engaged and excited about the work they were doing. And so while I was at a financial institution, I actually wasn't much of a banker, I would say. I was much more focused around culture. And so that kind of work actually led me to be able to work with some other financial institutions because of them understanding the best practices that I was having there. And then that just eventually turned into a business. So this is what I've been doing full time for a couple of years, and working with dozens of companies to be able to help improve their culture. So it's been fun to be able to kind of make that switch from just sharing with one company to actually getting to share with loads of companies. So it's been good.
All right, thanks for sharing that, Kristen. I think Rhonda and I come from an HR background, and when people ask, what is it like to kind of have your own business, one of the things I always find myself responding is you get to work with organizations of all sorts of sizes and types, and it's really amazing the talent that is out there. We kind of
Yeah, I'd
asked.
say that's probably one of the things I enjoy most about it, is meeting so many interesting business owners and leaders, and just getting their perspective on things is, yeah, it's a joy.
Matter of fact, that is 2/3 of the target audience that we are trying to attract to these webinars, and that represents oftentimes the decision makers on who are using our services. It's people who own business, people who lead businesses, people who are in senior HR roles, and so that's why we're trying to pick topics that we think would be appealing to them. That is in large part why we wanted you to come on as, yes, the expert, and kind of share some of your insights. You have a slide here, and I think I'm supposed to be the one driving that. Are you ready to transition to your talking points? All right.
Sure. Sort of my principle behind what I do is that most leaders have really good intentions. I believe that most leaders are coming from a good place. They want to be good leaders, and they want to have good culture. The hard thing is that just because we have good intentions doesn't necessarily mean that we have good culture. I actually shared on LinkedIn this morning about my intentions to juice, and I find that I have carrots, rotting away in my vegetable bin week after week because I have the intention to juice these carrots. But the follow through is not always great. So you can see how, just because I bought the carrots or had the healthy mindset on Friday when I picked up the groceries doesn't necessarily translate to good health. And it works the same way with culture. So even though we can come from a really good place and want to be human-centered, want to be heart-centered, those sorts of things, doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be able to achieve that without kind of going a step further with it. And so that's leads into the next slide of why we really need to be able to create something that's systematic and sustainable, something that keeps us in the process of creating that good culture. Because what happens otherwise, there are a million things that can take us away from creating the good culture. I mean, just in one day, there are a dozen different fires that you could have to put out. So that's why it's so critical to be able to have those systems in place. So I'm interested from the group, if I may ask a question of the group, if they ever find that their day kind of gets swept away by doing work that is the now, the urgent, and not work that is strategic or working on the big goals. So if I could get a yes or no, an amen, anything like that in the comment section, I would appreciate to know if that's kind of resonating with you guys. I find sometimes, you go through a day and half the day is gone, and you think, what did I even do today? Because I had a to-do list, but I don't see those getting marked off, and I know I've been busy all day. Yeah, good. So that's resonating for some people. I'll make sure I'm looking at those. Yeah, awesome. So what really helps is when we have systems in place that allow for us to focus on that. So just moving into the next slide. So So what that is and what I'm creating is something called a nurture culture. And I call it that for a couple of reasons. First, you guys are probably abundantly familiar with the concept of the toxic culture. You probably have worked in a place at one point or another. You have a friend that works somewhere that has a toxic culture. And a nurture culture is essentially the opposite of that. So
Can I interrupt and ask this question?
Yeah,
If nurture
sure.
is the opposite of toxic, how do you define a toxic culture?
Yeah, so a toxic culture is somewhere where people are not supported, somewhere where overall the goals of the individual are being diminished, and we're focused more on the goals of the company. So without any regard for the individuals themselves, we're focused on the company. And while I think it's important to be focused on goals of the company, it has to go side by side with being focused on the individual. So that's what a nurture culture does, is help to focus on every individual, making sure we're using their strengths, supporting them in their work to get to the ultimate good of the company. Does that make sense or answer any questions?
It helps me. Thank you. I do appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, a toxic culture is one of those things that you know exactly what the definition is, or you feel the definition when you're in one. When you experience one, you know that it's toxic. So it's good to be able to spend time talking about the opposite of that, which is a nurture culture. And so a nurture culture, in order for that to happen, it has to have these systems, and these are the systems that I'm going to talk to you about here. So the first one, yeah, awesome, Mike. The first one is a culture code. And if you haven't heard of a culture code before, I'll just make it really simple for you. You've probably heard of a dress code before. A dress code is something almost every company has, and the focus is around telling people what they can or can't wear. And while we all have something like that, we don't necessarily all have something that says what we should and shouldn't do. And what I mean by that is around the expectations we have for each other in the company. A culture code is a cooperatively created thing with everyone in the company being able to make decisions on what their expectations are. So what we expect from each other as teammates, what we expect from our bosses, what our bosses expect from the employees. And it just clearly spells out what those expectations are and clears up tons of ambiguity. When you have something like this in place, that what this system allows is that then you notice when someone's not in alignment so much more clearly. So everybody begins to be able to clearly work together in the way that they had agreed upon. I want to pause here because this concept might be new to a lot of people, and go ahead and ask now, if that's okay with you, Mike, just what questions anybody has around culture code.
While those are coming in, let me ask one that's related to that.
Sure.
Kristen, when you begin working with an organization, they invite you in and you get to know them, and
Sure.
you're recognizing that their intention is to create a good culture.
Mm-hmm.
They may have bought the carrots on Friday and it's still sitting in their vegetable bin on Thursday morning, but they're acting on by bringing you in. And what I'm hearing you say thus far is that creating a nurturing culture has to be intentional. It's multi-pronged. And that what you're trying to do is instill something that could be best described as the exact opposite of a toxic culture.
Yeah, that's
And
exactly right.
so you're introducing this idea of a culture code. Do you find that organizations have already have one, or is that one of the early things you begin doing with a client to kind of help them articulate that code?
Yeah, I'd say that very few of the clients I start working with actually have a culture code. And this is I'm going to say a fairly new concept. It's just been around for maybe a decade. So it is something newer, but people typically have pieces of that culture code already in place. So I see Rebecca here has kind of asked the example, what's it, or asked the question, what's an example of a culture code? Who and when and how are culture codes created? So I'll kind of tie these two things in here. A culture code is fairly complex. And what I mean by that is we want to get to a level that is so much deeper than just saying things that companies typically have, which are like company values. So company values say things like, you know, we have integrity, we want to be innovative, you know, all those sorts of things. What a culture code does is actually dive into specific behaviors that allow for these values to be exemplified. So I'll just take one, for example. Maybe the company says we're open-minded. This is something that they say that they are, maybe in their values. And so that's a starting point for a culture code. We dive into that and say, well, do we believe this, first of all? Is being open-minded actually important? And how will we know if we're successful in being open-minded? And so one of the things we might say, one of the things we do within this organization is that every single idea that someone utters from their mouth gets written on the board, whether the person who's writing it on the board or not likes the idea. So what I mean by that is, like, we are truly opening our minds and we are writing these things on the board so this can be an option. We have a rule where we love something for 60 seconds, which means that everyone in an organization, when somebody throws an idea out, they immediately start with the assumption that they love it and they back into how they can love it instead of focusing on all the negatives about it. And so you begin to get specific enough within this code so that people kind of understand what specific behaviors exemplify the values.
So you're being very specific there, is that right? And that is,
yeah,
if the
really
ideal is open-mindedness, what you're challenging your client to do is, let's come up with specific examples, behavior that we're expecting from employees, from managers, even between interaction with customers. You're trying to drill down to specifics so that they know exactly what it is you mean by that. I hope that
we're trying
answers
to make
Rebecca's
it
question.
real. Yeah, trying to make it real instead of something that's just written on our wall, you know, just something we say that we do, but really making it actionable. And just to touch real quickly on the who and when, those sorts of things, this is something that's created with everybody or a sample population of the organization. So this is not just a top-down thing. And often one of the rebuttals I hear to the work that I do is like, a leader can't just create the culture. They can't just decide what the culture is going to be and it be that way, which is true. But we have to be intentional about things, and we can be intentional with our team. So we go to our team and we ask that question: what is important to us? How do you want to feel? What do you want to get from me at work? And that begins to build it. And it can be built at any point within the organization. So, you know, whether it's your first day as an organization or you've been in business for 50, 100 years, it's never a bad time to put together a culture code.
Thank you.
And
Hopefully
Kristen,
that answers your question, Rebecca.
And I have a quick question too.
Sure,
So is a culture code something that you create and put in writing and then distribute to everybody, post it, and is it kind of a takeoff from your core values? It sounds like it is, that core values are maybe the high level expectations and the culture code is more of the drill down, but is that all typically written? And then how often do you see companies generally update that?
Yeah, so this is definitely a written document, and it's something that I like to put in more of a slide format as like a deliverable to a client, but they would be able to kind of go through and see those, and then it takes life in a lot of different ways within the organization, but those should be revisited once a year, and it's something that we want to make sure that these are still things that we want to be values to us that we want to live up to. Maybe we tried for a year to be open-minded, and then we decided, hey, this isn't actually very important to us. I hate to use that as an example, but I started with that one, so I have to keep going now. But yeah, you revisit it every year with your team and you say, does this still make sense? And it should be tweaked every year. It's expected that it would be tweaked every year.
Well, if you're going to model open-mindedness, you have to be open to the possibility of not wanting to be open-minded as much.
That's so true.
Okay.
That's a great way to put it, Mike.
All right, well, good. Now, you also made some reference to that you just can't talk about it. You have to build it into kind of how you go about communicating that. Matter of fact, that may be your next point here, is it not?
Well, this actually gets into a lot of the things that we'll end up doing. So, for example, this next one here is creating a communication pattern. So basically making sure that this culture code is embedded in everything that we do, including the way that we communicate. And so being able to set up a cadence of communication where there's an expected level of communication that an employee will get with their leader on a weekly, bi-weekly basis, that they will get with a senior leader, maybe on a monthly, yearly basis, and set up this cadence. So then what you're essentially doing are being able to knock things off a to-do list instead of having to think every month, what's a way that I can meaningfully connect with my employees. You would already have this built-in system or pattern that you would use to be able to communicate these values. So I'll take, for example, one of the systems that these are not already implemented in an organization, that I almost always suggest to be implemented, which are one-on-one meetings. And one-on-one meetings are something I'm super passionate about, so I won't go down the road too much. But the value of being able to sit down one-on-one with your employee once a week or once every 2 weeks, to look them in the eyes, and even if it's just for 10 minutes, it doesn't have to be for a long period of time. And even if you're doing it over a computer screen, and even if it's not incredibly traditional or something really lofty, it is so important to have that communication pattern set up. One of the things that research has showed us is with leaders, it's less important exactly what they say and more important that they are saying something. So having actual communication and not letting there be radio silence on the other end is it's absolutely pivotal to starting to have a great nurture culture.
Kristen, you describe having a cadence of communication. I love that expression, so we may steal that. I love the concept. But you also said something that perhaps you were not aware of, but this is a recurring theme that we're hearing from our expert panelist, and that is the importance of one-on-one communication. Yes. We've been hearing that loud and clear, in large part because what this pandemic in particular has done, it's led to much more sense of isolation. A lot of more people are working remotely. The water cooler discussion is not what it once was. And so you're just saying that pre-COVID, this is your recommendation. It's even more important now, and that is individual touch, leader to the people they leaded one-on-one on a regular basis that feels like it has almost a cadence to it.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I think even with the COVID situation, I think it has allowed us to realize that we have to be more intentional. Often I'll ask people within an organization, I'll say something like, do you have one-on-one meetings with your employees? And in the beginning, they'll always say, yes, yeah, I have that. A lot of times when I walk through the break room and I see an employee standing there, I'll stop them and I'll ask how their day is and those sorts of things. And I kind of have to stop right there and say, that's not my definition of a one-on-one meeting. That is a one-on-one conversation. I get it. But it's important to have the intentionality behind setting up a time on the calendar that the employee knows they have your full attention, even if it's only for 10 minutes. That is so critical.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Let's go to the next one.
Perfect.
So yeah, the next thing that we want to be able to do is concentrate on strengths. And this is the number one thing statistically that people say is important to them about their job, is to be able to focus on strengths. And this is something I'm not going to elaborate too much on, because I think you guys are probably familiar. If you're on this call, you probably are familiar with some strengths testing and things like that. But more than just knowing what people's strengths are, it's really modeling your jobs after that, being comfortable with changing job descriptions to fit that, and ultimately setting up reward systems where people are rewarded for using their strengths, and not so much focus on fixing those weaknesses. We like to fixate on that, but I don't think it's nearly as much important. I think statistics show us it's not nearly as important to creating a good culture, but to creating a high-performing culture as well.
This is fascinating. I'm literally taking notes as you're going through here, so thank you.
Awesome. Okay, and so my last one here for you is to celebrate wins. And I put this last because it is incredibly important, not because it's least, but that this is something that if we have a structure to celebrate wins, we will be so much more likely to do. And what I hear from leaders so many times is, I want to be able, I want to show appreciation, but the way that I regularly do it tends to be with compensation and promotions. These are the things that, I'm pinged every year to do my annual review, or I'm pinged every year to do a compensation review. Well, what if we were pinged every week to celebrate an employee or to celebrate progress and those sorts of things? So setting up a system that's not just, the system is not just around monetary compensation, but around the things that are actually more important. When a Gallup poll, I think it was a 2018 study, showed that the top 3 ways that employees like to be appreciated have nothing to do with compensation at all. And these are the things that we're letting slide. These are the things that we don't have systems for. So we need to make sure we have a system to be able to celebrate those.
Kristen, when you used the word pinged to do, I misheard you. I thought you said pained to do, and it fit perfectly, because most of the folks we work with, they really don't want to do these performance reviews, and it shows in how they go about doing it. You're saying something totally different, and that is, if you're going to do it right. And if you're going to do it right, it means do it regularly. And if you're going to do it regularly, you need to be reminded of that. Therefore, the term pinged.
Yes, I think it's unfortunate that our systems that we have in place, we say we do a yearly review, and that's a system basically. What that allows us to do is know that every January or every April, whatever time limit you set, you're going to evaluate it. But we're not so good with the other ways that we show gratitude, which is a shame. So being able to set up systems like that are critical.
To some extent, I'm starting looking at your notes here, and it fits perfectly in what you have on your LinkedIn profile. And if you're not connected to Kristen, let me encourage you to do that. She does an excellent job with her blogs, but on her profile, she describes that there are really 4 systems that she recommends to clients. And here we are looking at those right in front of us. You had one more thing that I didn't want to miss over, and that is the assessing the culture.
Yeah, ultimately, we've got to make sure that all of this is assessed and measurable. And what I feel like people often say to me, like, you do the soft things, in a business, you're thinking about the soft skills. And yes, but that's not to diminish the idea that this can be measured. The outcome of these things can and should be measured. So making sure that you are assessing your culture when you're making any of these changes, being able to do that on the front end, and then ultimately, as a benchmark, and then ultimately see how these different measures are affecting that, so that you can get a reading again, so that you're assessing it again. And you can do these things with surveys, focus groups. Those sorts of things are great tools. Can often be a little bit hard to do in-house, so that's what people like me do a lot of times. But it's so important to get that, because you don't get money in your budget for doing this kind of work, or you won't continue to the next level if you're the CEO with this kind of work, if you're not assessing the value of it and how it's actually changing your culture. So don't forget that critical step. While it's not exactly what I would consider a system of the culture, it's certainly an important aspect that you measure it.
You know, Kristen, you shared with us that you came to this role as a result of being a chief of staff of a large financial institution. And chief of staff, as I envision that role, that's a kind of measure type role. And you're trying to say the exact same thing, is that when people bring you in, organizations bring you in, you haven't changed your sentiment regarding measurement. Yes, these may be, quote, soft skills. These may be soft concepts. You're saying it needs to be real. It needs to be defined. It needs to be measured. And what you're trying to do, I'm trying to make sure we don't lose sight of this, is that if you want to create an environment where people feel valued, then they're probably working in a nurturing environment. And you mentioned Gallup. Gallup year in, year out measures that. And one of the things they stress with employee satisfaction is, do they feel valued as an employee? And that is felt, does the company value me? Does my boss value me? Do my colleagues value me? Et cetera. Very well.
And that's what's so great. There's been so much years of data on this sort of thing. You actually can get good benchmarking data as well. So you're not just looking at, are we getting better every year, but you can also look at, how do we compare to our competitors? You know, when we're trying to hire someone to work here, what are they getting somewhere else that they can't get here? So the data excites me more than it should. I'll say that.
For those who have not joined us before, what we've kind of evolved to is a kind of a two-part process. Part one is we hear from an expert panelist, but then what we also want to do is also spend a little bit of time talking about kind of the things that we at Bench Builders tend to focus on. And what's been very nice is that often what it is that we're doing and what our expert panelist is recommending go kind of hand in hand. Kristen, can you stay with us for a little bit? Because I'd like to kind of get Rhonda kind of sharing some thoughts she had. And when we saw your topic and you and I were discussing about how do you develop a kind of a nurturing culture, one of the things that kind of just stepped out is, and that is, if that's going to be the case, what does this notion of diversity, how does that factor into that? What is this notion of inclusion? So what I like to do is ask Rhonda to speak to this, and then time permitting, that will allow both of us, all three of us actually, to kind of field questions and hopefully marry these two topics together nicely. So if that works for you, Kristen, stick with us. Yeah. Rhonda, why did you feel that it was important to include inclusion and diversity this week?
Well, I think, a couple weeks ago when we had our last webinar, we talked a little bit about some of the challenges companies are having right now with a lot of the racial unrest, protesting on top of COVID. And in a lot of articles I've been reading and information we've been discussing with people, there's a fairly new term called inclusion. And people, I think, can sometimes confuse that with diversity or not know exactly what the difference is between diversity and inclusion. And I think one thing that Kristen said, I think very much applies to the concept of diversity and inclusion. And that is, inclusion is in a lot of people's view, one step further than diversity. So diversity is really based on kind of the who and what. It's based on characteristics of people within your workplace. And a lot of companies have diversity goals. And if you are a company subject to OFCCP audits, affirmative action plans, you do have goals. And you have goals that generally are set up to have a staff in place that mirrors the community that you recruit from. So if you're in a community that's highly Hispanic based, then you should have a workforce that's highly Hispanic based. And if you don't, then you clearly don't have a diverse workforce that mirrors the community that you work in. So in the past, diversity seemed to be categorized more as gender and ethnicity. Those are the primary two goals. But now we see a lot of goals that also include veterans, disabled people. And then when you start talking about your diverse workplace, you also bring in things like different personality types, thinking styles, and there's a lot of different traits and characteristics that you look at when you consider whether you have a diverse workplace or not. And one of the, I think, downfalls that's human nature is when you're looking for people to come to work for you or looking for who you want as part of your team, it's most comfortable to have people that are like you because you relate best to them, you communicate easiest with them, you understand them. But the downside of that is if you have a whole bunch of people that are just like you, then everybody's going to think just like you. And you're not going to have a lot of creativity in your team. You're not going to have a lot of new ideas. You're not going to have the complements to what your weaknesses might be. So having a diverse workforce definitely drives a team and drives a company to higher performance. And that's been proven. There's a lot of statistics around that. Companies that have a more diverse workforce generally have higher sales revenue, more customer retention, higher profit margins, because they have diversity of ideas, problem solving, and more innovation. So diversity, just in terms of the makeup of your workforce, can definitely impact the performance of your company, and also just leads to being viewed, within your community as being a place that's open to diverse characteristics. So communication with a diverse team is definitely more complicated. And as Kristen has said, and we've said in so many meetings, it's so important to have open communication with your employees and with people that you work with. So that's even more important if you have a diverse workforce, because you want to understand differences in people and you want to understand where people are coming from. And then the step beyond that is inclusion, which we're hearing a lot more about recently. And so inclusion is really not so much about the characteristics of your workforce, but it's more about the actions and behaviors, similar to how Kristen talked about a nurture culture. Certainly inclusion, I would think, is part of a nurturing culture. And it's about the behaviors and actions that you see within your workforce and what type of a culture that your workforce is establishing for your employees. So it's recognizing and accepting differences in people. It's creating an environment where people are very comfortable speaking up, sharing their opinions, and not hesitant at all about being able to voice their feelings or their ideas or concerns that they may have. And if you don't have that, then people are stifling that and they're not speaking up. And then, sometimes you get to points where people are boiling inside because they don't feel like they can speak up and be heard. And then that results in a lot of other issues, obviously. But having an inclusive culture just really means that people feel comfortable at work. They feel comfortable with the people they work for. They're very much in a sense of belonging. They feel like part of the family, that they have friends there, and that the company is going to accept them for what they are, who they are, the ideas they have, and be very open-minded. And those are the types of things that make a company very desirable to work for. So your employees, if they work in an environment like that, are going to tell other people about it. And it's going to cause people to want to come and work for you. And it's going to cause people that have those values to want to come to work for you. So one thing, I'll talk a little bit about some of the things companies can do to create that inclusiveness, but I'm curious as well with people that are on the line, if you could share in the chat box some things that you're doing within your company that do create an inclusive work environment. So, if we can get some ideas, I think it'd be helpful to find out what other companies are doing that can be helpful to others on the call and give some ideas, because every company is different and people do different things, and it depends on the workforce you have, how big your company is, what the nature of your business is, and how you can integrate things like that.
Rhonda, I like the way you're asking the folks who are in attendance here to chime in. Let us hear from you. You're trying to include them in this conversation, so that's very good modeling. please go to your chat box and let us hear from you. What is the things you're seeing in your organization that either you're doing or you want to do to foster a more inclusive environment? Could I ask Rhonda, while we're waiting for those to come in, Kristen, I was watching you nod quite a bit while Rhonda was speaking. To what extent is what Rhonda is sharing differentiating diversity and inclusion to create, how does that fit into your recommendations to foster a nurturing culture?
Yeah, I think this is all a point with that you would establish a culture code. And somebody, I think, asked the question, something similar of how does diversity play into a culture code, or how does inclusion play into a culture code? And these would be the kinds of things that, you know, I'd hope that people would find to be important and would add those to their culture code. And then we can ask questions around, you know, say if we say we're an inclusive environment, then we can ask questions around, you know, do you have meetings after the meetings? Do you know what I'm talking about? Meetings after the meetings where nothing really gets done in the meeting, where all the people who were supposed to be there were there. But then afterwards, a few key set of people end up making all the decisions. That is the total opposite of inclusion, and it happens all the time. So you're able to kind of drill down and get specific about those kinds of behaviors, which leads to people not feeling included.
You saw, Rhonda, where Monique commented on that one of the things they try to do was to celebrate the World Cup. That's a fantastic idea. Now she goes on to write here, employees are encouraged to wear jerseys from their favorite team, bring food from the country that you're rooting for. Watch parties have been during the breaks, during work, and the World Cup has been piped into TVs across the facility's campus. That's a cool idea.
That is great. And a lot of those just informal activities that include employees can just lighten the workforce sometimes and just get people talking more. So little things like that. And I know right now it's very difficult to have a lot of group activities because of the social distancing that companies are being held to. But there's still things that you can do even with social distancing or through Zoom meetings like we're doing. But I think anything that includes people from different backgrounds and encourages people to open up and talk to each other, share things about each other, just gets people understanding each other a little bit better in more of an informal setting, and definitely opens up people's minds and creates more camaraderie amongst employees. And one of the most important things, though, is to really educate your employees and educating them on something that can be very tough, but that is unconscious biases. So many of us have unconscious biases. And again, unconscious meaning you might not even realize that you do. And a lot of it is just based on your upbringing, based on the environment that you were raised in, what you were taught. But sometimes you just need to educate employees on kind of recognizing what those unconscious biases might be so that they can work on changing them and can work on improving their open-mindedness to others that are different from them. So educating people, having little workshops to bring out points like that. Again, getting people from different environments, different backgrounds together to interact more. Starting at the top, and Rebecca mentions that they're working on a more diverse workforce starting at the top with their board of directors. And again, diversity is part of that. Showing that you have a diverse workforce and you're open to a diverse workforce definitely is your first step in the more inclusive and nurturing culture. But also just making sure that you have strong messages to your employees on what your expectations are of them, in terms of, respecting each other, being open-minded, listening to each other, training your managers on being inclusive and listening to employees, asking questions to really find out where people's mindsets are and what they're thinking, get their ideas. And, a very good thing that Kristen mentioned in terms of being inclusive is developing your culture code and including all your employees to put that together. I mean, there's nothing more inclusive than saying, let's all work on what our culture code is. So that's a great idea, Kristen, to really create inclusion with people in how you're going to establish your culture and what your expectation is of people going forward.
Kristen, you see Jason's comment. He was kind of giving you a shout out on the importance of the strength-based approach. If you can read that, he was emphasizing that as powerful. Do you want to comment on Jason's comment?
Yeah, I would say that that is so strong in being inclusive. If we just begin to define people by stereotypical forms of diversity, and it's not, and inclusion, and it's not that it's not important to take that into consideration, but if that is as far as we go with inclusion, we're making a big mistake. And understanding people's strengths and truly what they bring to the table, like what capital they have to offer. And by capital, I mean like, whatever it is within themselves that they can offer to the group. That is so much more powerful in feeling included, because what we're doing is like not drawing on a stereotype of someone to contribute something, but drawing on who that person is as an individual to be able to contribute and to be included. So that was awesome, Jason, for pointing that out.
And I think, Mike, there's another comment here from Kevin, which is really good. Our company has encouraged ARGs, which are associate resource groups, which has raised the value of diversity, but also has encouraged inclusion of all associates. We had a hangout with our African American ARG that had a panel sharing their personal challenges that allowed all participants to walk in their shoes. Very powerful. Excellent idea. And I think, until you hear from people and what some of their challenges have been, what some of their life experiences have been, you don't know and you don't understand, and it's very difficult to relate to them. But when you hear it and it's real and you can better relate to that, you're definitely going to open up that culture a little bit more and open up that communication between people. So that's an excellent idea, Kevin. Thank you.
One of the things that Kevin raised is the importance of just being able to walk in other people's shoes. And I can't believe we're about out of time, but that might kind of serve as a natural transition. Kevin, you probably didn't know this, but what I would say to you, it was that in mind when we asked Amanda Jelks to be next week's expert panelist. For those in the Chattanooga area, you will know her as a former corporate attorney who made the decision to hang out her own shingle and start a legal practice to bring other lawyers into that practice. What made her an attractive panelist is that not only would she be able to speak to us next week on working with businesses, most of her clients are small businesses, but she is also a small business owner. And we're mindful that a lot of folks who do participate in these, you own your own business, you're leading businesses. She's a small business owner, and she's been in business for a number of years. And what she's going to be speaking to and on next week was going to be, what did she wish she had known then that she knows now? She wanted to change this that reads the 5 things everyone should know when starting your own business. I mentioned Amanda in part because she's a competent attorney. She understands small business. She's a small business owner, but she also is an African-American female. And we think it's that perspective that will make her just a great expert panelist. So Kevin, we appreciate your making reference where you work on how that has been helpful in your organization. We hope that having Amanda with us next week will do the exact same thing. Kristen, you have masterfully covered a very broad subject in a relatively small amount of time. So I want to say thank you for being with us today.
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity. I don't know that I would have called it masterfully, but at least we got through some stuff. So I feel like in a short amount of time, we were able to talk through some deep subjects. So that's always fun.
Some of the comments that were made, some of the questions you have are a little bit detailed. And that is, if you have questions that you would like to get answered, in the follow-up email will be a link that if you want to get on Rhonda's calendar or my calendar for us to just kind of follow up and answer your questions, we're happy to do that very thing. I think Rebecca asked, how do I learn more? And so this will be in your follow-up packet, but if you want to reach out, and learn a little more about from Kristen. Here's her contact information to include her email address. Let me encourage you to go and do that. Likewise, here's our contact information at Bench Builders. In terms of kind of what we were going to try to cover, Kristen, did we get most of what you hoped that we would be able to covered in our time together?
I think so. Yeah, it was great.
Rhonda, how about you? Did we leave something unaddressed that we should have covered, we did not?
No, I don't think so. I think I would just end with a statement that we made a couple weeks ago as well, and that is actions are louder than words. So you can put things in place, you can create a culture code, you can create goals, but until your employees really see that in action, it's not going to have any impact. So make sure that you're demonstrating the actions that you want to create the culture within your workplace, and that your employees see and understand that, and that you communicate to them the expectations for their actions as well.
You know, the action comment you made just there, you as participating in these Q&A sessions, you by your action are really flattering us. You're taking the time to sign up for these, to actually carve out an hour on a Thursday morning, and if you can't attend in person, you know you get the recording afterwards. It is very flattering. We've had literally hundreds of folks who have done so in the last 15 weeks. We're very, very pleased that you've been able to join us. So Kristen, on behalf of Rhonda and me, thank you again for you spending time with us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks to everyone who's listening. I was glad to have good interaction from the crowd.
Well, we were too. And Rhonda, as always, I enjoy spending time with you this morning. And so on behalf of Bench Builders, thank you for being with us today. Go out there. Bear in mind, we started our time together thinking about the positive in a very negative time. Let me encourage you to do that very thing. Go into the world today, continue your day, thinking positive, look for what can be done in your sphere of influence to create a more inclusive environment, and what steps you can take as a leader, as a business owner, to offer a more nurturing culture in your organization. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. Goodbye.